Don't turn that dial.
A dangerous mistake to make.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Returns right now on WCPT 820.
Joining me is John Shaw, director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute. That's at Southern Illinois University. John, how are you today?
Hey, Joan, Happy New Year to you. We haven't spoken in 2025, so I hope you're doing well.
Yes. All things considered, I'm doing as well as could be expected. You know, I was talking with somebody recently. When Donald Trump was elected the first time, I mean, it was like somebody poured ice water over your head. And, you know, there was all of a sudden there was the Indivisible Guide, and there were indivisible chapters being formed all over the country. And it was like there was, you know, we picked ourselves up off the floor and we were getting ready to fight. This time around, I believe that immediate anger, that immediate burst of energy is a little bit, the reaction is a little bit different this time. I think this Donald Trump victory has been harder to bounce back from. I do still think that there's going to be an awful lot of resistance, but I think it is going to be not quite so fueled by anger. I think this is going to be a colder, more measured kind of resistance this time around. What's in the people you know? What have you seen as far as the difference between this Trump election and the last Trump election?
Well, no, I think you framed it really nicely. I mean, I think that in 2016, you know, it was a shocking election, a shocking result. I remember as a reporter, I was covering the 2017 inaugural outside, and it was just this, even, you know, among the inaugural goers, it was just a sense of kind of disbelief. And there was a sense of it being something of a fluke. You know, Hillary Clinton wasn't a great candidate, you know, and so forth. You know, now I think we're facing a much more sober reality, which is after a presidency that was uneven, at least, and, you know, included, you know, the total debacle on COVID and, you know, January 6th. And, you know, given that entire body of evidence and subsequent criminal indictments and criminal conviction, with that entire body of evidence, you know, the American people voted for Donald Trump again. And, you know, as one article said, you know, we can no longer say, you know, who are we? I mean, you know, the nation chose Donald Trump. And so I think there is a kind of a shell shock and disbelief for certainly, you know, almost half the population who opposed him. And again, let's just get one thing on the table that I heard one commentator say when we, you know, talk about just the size of Trump's win. I think the numbers now show that he won something like 49.8 and Harris won like 48.5. So
yeah,
he won by like 1.3%. Yeah. It was not this, you know, it was not this overwhelming landslide. I mean, he did win all 7 swing states, so that was, you know, that you have to give him that. So to answer your question, I mean, I think the you know, among the Democrats, there is this sense that Trump, in some way, has found a message that resonates with a large group of Americans, and he's tapped into something that is here for a while. It's not just, you know, something that passed in kind of a fluke. So I think that to speak more specifically to your point, I mean, I do think that the Democrats have to do some recalibration and say, okay, you know, what is it about almost half the American people? What is it about Trump that almost half the American people resonated with or responded to? And at least have that as your initial frame. And then you need to do some soul searching about where you have gone wrong. And then you need to find areas of I don't want to use the word resistance, but areas of response. And I think, as you said, the last time it was a sort of, okay, we're going to resist everything. And frankly, I think a lot of people started, every tweet and every kind of Trump utterance, there was this indignation and anger. And I think now there's a more tempered response, which is, this is going to be hard. And this is, from the Democratic perspective, this is going to be bad. But they need to focus on, the policies that are actually going into effect, find ways to respond to those, to discuss them intelligently, to formulate a new agenda that speaks to the American people. So I think there's just a lot of work to do. And I think just utterly pragmatically, and I read this from a blog, Democrats need to be focused on one thing, which is winning back the House in 2026, because when you have control of one institution, whether it be the House or Senate, it just allows you to do some stuff in terms of blocking bad things that you cannot do when the other party controls all the levers of government. So I think in terms of I think the Democrats need to find ways to respond to the Trump agenda, and he has narrow majorities in Congress now. Admittedly, Republicans have gone lockstep on almost everything, but there are going to be some things where there is going to be some splintering in his base, and Democrats need to be alert to that and be able to respond.
There has been some advice offered that maybe, because I agree with you, we would like to regain some control with the midterm elections, and some have said, what, let Trump be Trump. You know what? Let it be awful. Let it be horrible. Let people see what they voted for, and then maybe they'll wake up and say, "Whoa, this isn't what I meant. This isn't what I thought he would do," and that might be a winning strategy for the midterms. What do you think about that advice?
Well, I think just the practical thing is, that is what is going to happen. Trump and the Republicans own Washington for the next 2 years. And so, the midterms are going to be a 100% referendum on the Republican Party and the Trump agenda. That's what it's going to be. So that's the reality. I guess what I would say is going after that, if I were a Democrat, I would much rather have control of one chamber, however small it is, just to be able to, to chair, to be able to organize committees and to be able to have oversight hearings. Those are just kind of some simple mechanical things that you can do when you control one chamber that you cannot do when you are just, kind of a large minority in both chambers. So the bottom line is, Trump owns Washington for the next 2 years, and the American people in 2 years are going to have a really clear, decision about whether they like what they've seen. But going, I think the Democrats really need to try to position themselves to make some big gains in the House and also locally. We cannot forget that, the Democratic Party has lost lots of its standing, in state and local elections and so forth. So this needs to be a kind of, across the board rebuilding and regrouping and reformulating.
One thing, John, that I thought was interesting is that even though Donald Trump won at the presidential level, a lot of those same states that went for Donald Trump ended up installing Democratic senators, Democratic governors, Democratic congresspeople. It was almost, it seemed like there was a lot of split balloting going on.
Yeah, I do think so. I guess as an analyst, we need to kind of take the big picture and speak a truth, which is Trump is a singular force in American politics. I don't understand his appeal. I have to say, I understand parts of his appeal. I understand his ability to tap into anger and resentment. There's a mastery of his tapping into resentment and anger. But what I don't see, and this connects to his inaugural, he said, the golden age begins now. And he just said how awful things are now and says, things are going to turn around and, just lays out a whole litany of things that are going to change. Well, are the Trump voters in 2 years going to hold him accountable? Are they going to say, okay, you said the golden age begins now. How come inflation is at still 5%?
Mm-hmm.
How come,
you promised us eggs would be cheaper.
That's right. Gas is going to go down, and so forth. So I guess the part of the Trump appeal that perplexes me is he makes these grandiose promises. I mean, he lays out a grim scenario, doesn't really appeal to people's better angels. And this is unusual in American politics. Usually a winning formula is to have a hopeful, positive vision.
Mm-hmm.
But, he posits this dark America, and then he says it's going to fundamentally change. And let's see what happens in 2 years from now. And the voters are just going to have to reckon with it. But he is a dominant force, and the Democrats have not found a way to respond to him. They just have not, and that's just a fact of political life right now.
Well, especially, it's almost like the idea of Trump got elected because, if you saw the rallies where he didn't make any sense and where, that one rally where for like 38 minutes he just danced. Come on. This, you didn't vote for that guy because, he had some policy ideas that you loved. It's John Shaw is the director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute. We have so many more questions for him. We'll be right back after this.
Now back to Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive on WCPT 820.
Joining me is John Shaw, director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute. We are, of course, talking about the election. And, John, there is the camp that says that Joe Biden promised to be a transition president, and if he had just stuck with that, and as soon as the midterm elections were over, said, I just want you to know I'm not running again, there would have been lots of time for Democrats to really test the field and find a candidate everybody could really get behind. And then there's the other camp. Somebody texted in, one of my listeners texted in this morning, Democrats lost the election because they threw Joe Biden under the bus. Many people I know did not vote because of that. Kind of one of those damned if you do, damned if you don't situations. Where do you fall in this?
Well, I have to say that I've adjusted my thinking. I do think in retrospect, Biden should have, after the midterm, said, I've taken us through the dark ages of COVID. I've got the economy back on track. I've laid the foundation, and let's move forward. And let's open up the process. The problem with that, of course, is, there was no obvious heir apparent. Vice President Harris was a formidable figure, and I think has emerged this, after the campaign as a formidable figure. But it would have been an ugly, messy process. And I'm sure Biden, he spent a lifetime trying to get to this job, at least his political lifetime. He got it. He had defeated Trump before, so he can be forgiven for believing, I'm the one who, since there's no real clear heir apparent, I'm the one who can take him out. In retrospect, that was wrong. And I guess the thing that, and this is hard to know, but certainly as those of us, watched him in the summer, it was, he clearly had lost a step. Multiple steps, and he was no longer anywhere near as mentally acute. And I remember about a year ago talking to a former congresswoman who said that she was at some event with Biden, and she said, I was stunned because, he, walked by a group of us, and there was about 10 of us who he knew for years, and he could not remember any of our names. And she said, I just gasped at that. This was like a year ago. So clearly some Democrats, saw that he had declined precipitously and were just hoping to be able to just kind of push the candidate through. Obviously, in my view, the debate was a horrific mistake. I think there's just nothing to be gained by debating Trump. even the most mentally sharp and rhetorically agile person, it's really hard to debate someone who doesn't operate in the world of fact. And so, So I think the debate was just a tragic mistake, and I do think that I think Harris ran a much better race than Biden would have won. I think there's maybe Biden would have picked up a few more votes in a couple places than Harris did. But so ultimately, I sadly say that, I have great respect for Biden. I think history may very well treat him well. Remember, our last two one-term presidents, George H.W. Bush and Jimmy Carter, were kind of reviled and dismissed as they left office. And now history looks on them as both pretty formidable presidents. So it's hard to know what the sweep of history is going to say about Biden. But right now it looks like, he was not able to read just the political fortunes. He stayed in too long and opened the door for Trump's return, which in the view of many Democrats is, the most unforgivable of sins.
John, I read that in July, Chuck Schumer met with Joe Biden and told him how bad his polling was, his favorability rating, and the fact that it looked like he did not have the ability to beat Donald Trump. And the point of the article was that apparently, I think Charlie Sykes wrote about this, apparently this was news to Joe Biden. And Charlie Sykes' argument was, where's the staff? The president has access to some of the best polling possible, inside polling, private polling. And in July, he didn't know how bad he was doing. I mean, I understand a staff being loyal and protective. I mean, certainly toward the end of Reagan's second term, the people around him were well aware of the fact that he was suffering from dementia, and they really protected him. But don't you think it's a little bit different to protect somebody who wants to campaign again and run again? I mean, whose job was it? I mean, you would think it would be Jill Biden's responsibility to say to Joe, look, sweetheart, I love you, but I think you've got to stick with what you said before, that you were getting out of the business. Whereas immediately after that horrible debate performance where Biden was just out of it, supposedly it was leaked that Jill Biden was really, really angry because she felt that Joe had been improperly prepped. That was why he was improperly prepped. That was why he couldn't get a sentence out that night. So maybe she was in denial too. But it just seems, when you've been in politics for a long time, do you end up being surrounded, John, by people who only tell you what you want to hear?
Sadly, I think that's often the case. And sometimes it's just they have this kind of devotion and loyalty. They've seen you through thick and thin and feel like their responsibility is to stay with you for the long haul. In some cases, I don't mean to be too jaded, but their fortunes, their power, and their livelihoods are also connected to the candidate. So there might be there is some distorting effect there. You would think that the president's family, would have been very concerned. Although, those of us who've had parents who've gotten elderly and have had, dementia issues, I mean, it comes. Sometimes it develops very gradually, and you just, you are in denial. So, I mean, I think it's going to be hard to really disentangle, the dynamic between the staff, the Biden family and so forth. But I think, from the perspective of, the Trump inauguration in 2025, I mean, I think most Democrats wish that Biden, right after the last midterms, would have said, I'm going to stay for the end of this term, and we're going to keep fighting for our policies, but it's time to bring in a new generation of leadership. And I think that would have, certainly from the vantage point of today, been a better alternative to what happened. But again, I also want to emphasize, I think I know it's not popular to say this. I came out of this campaign with a much, much greater respect for Vice President Harris's just political skills and charisma and toughness and grace. And I have to say this, just, everything from presiding over the Senate, in which, she, affirmed Trump's victory, to the way she comported herself today. I think that was just total, utter class, the way she's conducted herself. And I think she is. I think she has a political future, whether it's as governor of California or running again for the presidency. I mean, I think Harris stepped up at the last minute and ran a really impressive campaign, and probably just did not have. I know there's a lot of revisionism as to whether she should have distanced herself from the administration. I just think 100 days out.
She was asked to do something impossible. She was still the vice president to Joe Biden. And yet everybody was like, well, how do you disagree with him? How are you going to be different? That's a really fine line to walk. I mean, do you dare say, well, I think in the Middle East, President Biden and I have very different approaches. I mean, because that's kind of biting the hand that has promoted her and fed her.
Yeah, and I guess it was, some would say, I don't find this persuasive, but they would say you find a couple small issues, the oil depletion allowance. I really disagreed, substantially. Find two or three kind of small things that, you can try to erect a little bit of distance, but they don't, are not fundamentals. I know there's been some revisionist view that was a critical point in the campaign, that she should have distanced herself from Biden. I don't think that was a deciding factor. I mean, I think it was, she had 100 days to run against a guy who's been running for 10 years. And she ran a really, really formidable campaign. She destroyed him in the debate, had a really good convention. And who knows that some elements of racism and gender bias were clearly at work, I think. So I think she ran a good campaign, and I think she's going to be around the political scene for some time.
Well, we can talk more about that when we come back from a break. John Shaw is the director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute. That's at Southern Illinois University. We are going to talk about Kamala's future and the fact that Karen Pence and Michelle Obama decided to take a pass on today's festivities and other things when we come right back after this.
Don't turn that dial.
A dangerous mistake to make.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive, returns right now on WCPT 820.
I'm joined by John Shaw, director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University. And you just said, Mr. Shaw, that you think Kamala Harris has a bright future ahead of her. I don't know what the long-standing traditions may be in this instance, but I can tell you that a lot of people who are listening to this station, people who, for the most part, would be Kamala Harris supporters, were very disappointed by the fact that she disappeared. She and Joe Biden both. It was like as soon as they lost the election, it was like Donald Trump was already president. They were doing very few, almost no public appearances. Donald Trump was stepping out and making pronouncements. And I know because I get the White House schedule. And I expected after that crushing loss that Kamala Harris would take some time to just maybe catch up on her sleep, process everything she'd been through. And then I expected her not to be on the campaign trail, but to be present but to say to Democrats that we're going to be okay. We're going to get through this. We are all going to work together. Any sort of message of positivity and hope. And day after day, John, I got her schedule. Oh, the vice president will be privately meeting with staff. There will be no public appearances. The vice president will be privately meeting with staff. The vice president will be privately meeting with staff. She disappeared. And a lot of people who listen to this station are very upset by that. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, that's an important point. I guess I think it breaks in a couple of different ways. First of all, I would be more critical of President Biden and his staff. I mean, it did feel to me that after the election, there's been this fairly venerable tradition in American politics, and we have one president at a time, and that the president-elect just stay back and let the current president, fill out his term and then step in afterwards. And that's a venerable tradition. And I've done some research and actually written a book on a couple of presidential transitions in which that is the norm. So, I mean, this was an utterly strange situation where Trump, being Trump, was hugely assertive. The Biden, I thought Biden kind of faded into the background and just was deferential to him in a way that was completely unacceptable. And that I think also kind of made the question or raised the question about just sort of his mental acuity and ability to sort of, stick in the trenches and fight it out. Harris, I guess I think it's a harder call because, you lose an election and it's devastating and it's, the hardest thing you've ever gone through. And let me just tell you a quick story and I'll get back to it. I once interviewed, this was some years ago, George McGovern. And he of course, famously lost 49 states in 72. And I interviewed him, this was like in 2001 or 2 on a book that he'd written. And at the end of it, I said, Senator, I have to ask you, do you ever think about that election? And he said, every day. And here's a guy, this is 30 years later, and he loses by 49 states. So, I think I would give Harris some slack for just the crushing nature of the defeat. And the other thing is, if you immediately jump back on the stage, it looks like you're being ungracious. You're not accepting the results of the American people. So,
that depends on what you say and how you say it. I don't think it necessarily has to appear ungrateful, but I can't tell you. I've read about this as well as hearing people talk about this. There seems to have been, as soon as the election was over, a complete leadership vacuum. And nobody from Congress, nobody from Chris Murphy a couple of weeks ago gave an interview and he was like, where are the Democrats? Why aren't we planning? We're getting together and figuring out what we're going to be doing and how we're going to fight. Where are the Democrats? And I got to tell you, I was going, Chris, you're talking about exactly what my listeners are talking about, too. It seemed like there was just that the Democrats folded up their tent and went home, and there was nothing to conflict with the Donald Trump show every day.
I agree with that, and but I would put the onus more on congressional leaders. And this is where it occurred to me at the time, and it's even more so as you frame the question, kind of the sort of the misfortune that Nancy Pelosi had stepped down as Democratic leader. Because if she were the Democratic leader, the minority leader, even if she had lost the majority and the presidency, she would have been there, holding press conferences, doing events, responding, preparing, the Democratic agenda. And I think Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer kind of went into a fetal position and in a way that I think was harmful to the party. So I would be the first to say I thought the Democrats after November, whatever it was, 6, just disappeared. But I would put the onus as much on the congressional leaders who are still in office and are going to be in office for not putting forward an agenda, not being visible, not asserting themselves as players. I would put the onus more on them than I would Harris, who's going to be leaving office. She laid out her agenda to the American people. It was defeated. And so, I mean, I can understand her perspective that, I laid it out and they said, no, what am I supposed to do? Just keep showing up. So I'll cut her slack on that one there. Now, if she disappears for the next year, no. But I think for the 60 days or so after the election, I think it's fair to give her some slack. And I do think it's fair to ask Democratic leaders in Congress and some governors, too. Why weren't you out more front, visible?
Well, initially, Gavin Newsom and J.B. Pritzker came out strong. Remember Pritzker saying, Donald Trump comes after Illinois, he's going to have to go through me. And Gavin Newsom also said some pretty strong things. And then again, from them, it was almost like Hakeem Jeffries called them up and said, oh, dude, stop talking. I don't know. It was like radio silence after that. I don't understand it.
Yeah, no, I think because even both Newsom and Pritzker were talking about, having special sessions to kind of, Trump-proof, their states and kind of construct policies to sort of mitigate what they perceive as the kind of the worst of Trumpism. And I agree with you that they came out visibly early and then both sort of receded. And I did wonder why after that initial push they pulled back. So I don't know. I mean, I think we are where we are. I would give Harris some slack, but it will be interesting to see what happens in the next 60, 90 days, because I think the one thing is clear is Trump's going to come out fast and he's going to come out hard. And the Democrats, cannot be on their heels. I mean, they don't have power in terms of control of chambers, but they got to be able to respond, and they got to be able to assert themselves as visible figures rather than just sort of passive players in this unfolding drama.
Yeah. While we're on the subject of women in political life, Michelle Obama and Karen Pence, the former First Lady, the former Second Lady, apparently have decided to take a pass on the inauguration today. Do we care about that?
I sort of, I'm going to just be very personal. I sort of thought good for them because I know everyone's relationship is different, everyone's marriage. But I know, like my wife and myself, if she has a work event that I really don't want to go to, I might say, do you want me to go? And she'll say, yes or no. And then we have a certain point. It's like, if you need me to be there, I will be there. If you need me to be there, I'll be there. If you don't need me to be there, I will not be there because I have the other things to do. And she does the same thing for me. And I have to believe, I have no way of knowing this, but I have to believe that in this case, both cases, both Pence and Mike Pence and Barack Obama, said their spouses, do you need to be here? And I suspect Michelle and Karen Pence were pretty emphatic in saying, I will be there only if you absolutely need me to be. And in both cases, they said, no, take the day off and, do constructive things at home or whatever,
Well, Karen Pence got a lot of media attention at Jimmy Carter's funeral because as after his body was removed and everybody was like standing up and shaking hands, Mike Pence stood up and shook Donald Trump's hand. Karen Pence not only did not shake his hand, she didn't stand up. She remained seated. And people were like, oh, my, somebody, I can't remember who said, she has redeemed the name Karen for all time going forward. Now to be a Karen will be to be brave and resist.
Yeah, and good for her. I mean, it wasn't that long ago, 4 years ago, that there was a noose on the Capitol lawn and people saying, hang Mike Pence, and Donald Trump did nothing to discourage it. So I would hope that, if that were a scenario where the case for me, my wife would have a memory of at least 4 years and remember this person wanted to have me hung. So
yeah,
I will cut them both some slack on their no shows.
Yeah. John Shaw and I are going to take another quick break. He's the director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University, and we're going to be right back after this.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive on WCPT 820.
With me is John Shaw, who's the director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University. We have been talking about the election and the inauguration. John, I read something that I don't know if what I read didn't make sense on its own or whether I just can't make sense of it. Someone who I read, this morning or yesterday, said one of the mistakes the Democrats made in their messaging was that they focused on how Joe Biden had raised the hourly wage, and they should have been focused on median household income. It kind of seems like splitting hairs to me. Can you make some more sense out of that?
Yeah, I don't. That doesn't persuade me. I mean, I think they needed to have made a more thematic case that, just even in terms of overall jobs. I saw this number some time ago, and I haven't re-looked at it again. But I mean, I think that during the Trump presidency, the first term, there was actually net job loss. Now, this was distorted, of course, by COVID and the millions of jobs that were shed, and the sort of March 2020 to the end of the year. But I mean, in terms of just overall job growth, there was more substantial job growth in Biden's one term than in Trump's term. I think they could have just framed that issue better than they did. And this is maybe, I know people disagree with me. I think on the inflation issue, I mean, I guess you can't. I mean, the fact is that the administration has almost zero effect on inflation. I mean, it's largely monetary policy conducted by the Federal Reserve Board. And maybe that's too complicated to explain to people in a campaign. Maybe it looks too much like, hey, it's not my fault. But I do think that the Democrats could have made a much better case about just the economy during the 4 Biden years. I mean, I think it was stronger than is being given credit for. Now, people have a reality that they experience, and it's, kind of perilous politically to say, oh, the pain that you perceive to be feeling is not real. You're just not getting it. So it's hard to tell people something that they don't feel. But I mean, I think the numbers are such that the Democratic performance on the economy was pretty good. And I think that they ceded the issue to the Republicans in a way that I thought was just politically ridiculous. I just felt like they had a much stronger case to make. And I don't know that they needed to, start, distinguishing between hourly wage growth and other sorts of kind of arcane measures. But I think they could have made the broader case much more effectively than they did.
I want to talk to you about communication skills. Joe Biden, with his many years in government, particularly at the federal level, was somebody who knew how to get the sausage made. He knew about meeting with people. He kept things private until there was something to announce. He was very, very old school, but he was not anybody's idea of a good communicator. I mean, I'm thinking, FDR played to his strengths with his radio fireside chats and his melodious voice and his ability to speak to regular people. Bill Clinton, for all of his sexual shenanigans, in person apparently could charm the farthest right voter completely over to his side. He just had such charisma. Ronald Reagan was, whatever you may think about him as a politician, he was a great speaker. He had a folksy charm. Are we at the point now where if a president doesn't have some kind of superior communication ability, they are going to be a one-term president, or they are going to not be elected at all? I mean, I think Joe Biden did himself a disservice by not, whenever he was making particularly a address from the White House, when anybody would talk about his stutter, apparently his response was, oh, I don't have a stutter anymore. I got over it. but he clearly still had a terrible speech impediment. Even before that disastrous debate where he seemingly couldn't stay focused or keep a thought in his head, his speech was stumbling and bumbling and mumbling, and he never seemed to want to acknowledge it. And I kind of think that if he'd have acknowledged the elephant in the room, he would have been a more effective communicator. But how important is that ability to have that kind of charisma or that kind of ability to connect with people?
You know, that's a really interesting question, Joan. And I guess as you're framing it, I mean, I thought of Trump. And, I mean, you watch his rally, he is stunningly inarticulate. Stunningly, I mean, rambling, incoherent. But he did, I mean, it was sort of the kind of smart aleck humor that, you know, the guy in junior year, I mean, the guy sitting in the back of the room was, you know, saying snarky stuff as your chemistry teacher trying to put formulas on the board or something. So, I mean, you know, Trump is hardly a great communicator in any conventional sense. I mean, he has, you know, a couple themes that he just keeps ramming home, you know, for his base, you know, the sort of, you know, sarcasm and name calling and the kind of sophomoric stuff works. So, I mean, I do think you need to find ways to connect with voters, to communicate with them, to signal that you sort of get what their concerns are. But I think like Obama was a superb communicator and storyteller, and Clinton as well, and Reagan and so forth. But I mean, Trump kind of raises a more difficult question because he's in no way a skilled, polished communicator, but he does connect with his audience. And people, you know, even though lots of people would leave the rallies, I mean, they sort of liked that kind of smart alecky, you know, sense of humor. So I don't know, the world of political communication is so hard for me to kind of fully fathom because, you know, it's clearly not. It's not like there's this hunger for Adlai Stevenson-like eloquence and erudition and, you know, quotes from Shakespeare and that sort of stuff. I mean, at this point in American politics, that is looked upon as suspect. But you do need to find ways to communicate and to let people know that you understand what their concerns are and that you have solutions. And, you know, Biden certainly was not effective with that. I thought Harris was pretty good, but she had so little time to really, you know, kind of formulate a message. So she had to kind of go with what she had.
The one thing that I want to speculate on, and I know people like you, John, hate to speculate, but I'm going to make you, is J.D. Vance. Do you see him playing any kind of real role in the Trump administration, or now that, you know, he served his purpose, is he just going to be, you know, shunted aside and never heard from again?
You know, I think I don't expect him to play a real heavy role. I mean, look at, you know, Pence, you know, 4 years ago or 8 years ago when he came in, you know, he had good relationships on Capitol Hill. He had been a governor. You know, he had a relatively deep body of political work. And, I mean, he was a little bit of a, you know, conduit to Mitch McConnell and to the various House Republican speakers. But Trump, as best I recall, you know, did not in any way bring him in on the inner circle. And, you know, of course, in the end, he was just trying to use them to overturn, you know, electoral laws. So, and I'd also, the other thing, too, is, I mean, Vance is so clearly angling to be a successor to Trump. And I don't think Trump loves he likes to be the center of the show. And so I don't think he loves having an ambitious young man looking over his shoulder, kind of eyeing the throne that Trump sits on. And I think it's going to be so interesting, too, in terms of just the GOP politics. I mean, like Marco Rubio. I mean, the thing that I wonder is, like, first of all, well, even more broadly, why would anyone want to be in Trump's cabinet? Didn't they see what happened to Jeff Sessions, who gave up a Senate seat, was the first to support
and
Trump,
ended up getting humiliated.
And fired by a tweet. I mean, up and down, all the generals who are, fired, and national security advisors fired by tweets, Rex Tillerson. So, first of all, I don't understand why you would want to be in the Trump cabinet. I mean, this is not even a political thing. I mean, just the way the guy operates, that, if he just at some point gets tired of you, you're gone and you're going to be dismissed.
The first time Marco Rubio disagrees with him, he's gone.
Yeah, and that's, and I think with Rubio, here I'll speculate. I mean, for me, when he took the appointment, it's like, okay, he's hoping that he could stay for 2 years and then run for president. And he's made the kind of judgment that, with other senators, in terms of Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley and then J.D. Vance when he was still in the Senate, that he needed to, if he was going to go for the Republican nomination again, he would need to do it from a different platform than the Senate. And so he took Secretary of State. But yeah, I mean, if he makes it a year, I would be surprised. 2 years would shock me. But I think Vance will be, is certainly going to try to be as visible as possible and kind of position himself to run. And again, I don't think Trump likes that kind of second subordinate, and it will be an interesting dynamic to see how this relationship unfolds.
Well, and also too, why would Trump turn to J.D. Vance for anything when he has Zuckerberg, Bezos, and Musk, who can be just as sycophantic, and they have a lot more money?
Thank you for mentioning that, because when I watched, first of all, I mean, the notion that all these, billionaire plutocrats were at the inaugural and were actually seated with cabinet members.
They were in front of the cabinet. They weren't just seated with them. They were in front of them.
And it just, and to me, I don't know how people like Zuckerberg, you're a billionaire. I mean, why would you be willing to be a supplicant in the way he is? And I understand pragmatically tax breaks and other sorts of things, but don't you have just a minimal level of human pride in which you say, I'm not going to be, a message boy or a supplicant to Donald Trump? So I don't know. I mean, obviously, and I suspect, certainly Elon Musk, I will predict in 6 months he is back in wherever, running Tesla or whatever he's doing. I mean, he does not have the sort of willingness to do the hard, specific detail work of actually making government reform work. I mean, he'll throw in a few cliches and talk about blowing stuff up, and then he will get bored and he'll move on to something else. So I don't think
he'll get bored, or he will continue to overstep. Donald Trump has already chastised him once about staying in his lane. And now we've got the other Doge head, Vivek Ramaswamy, basically bolting because he's going to run for governor of Ohio. So half of Doge is already gone.
Yeah, Doge is going to be one of these short-lived entities. I think it might be something that historians kind of chuckle at a few years down the road if they even remember it. So I do not expect it to have a major impact in reshaping American life.
Yeah. How long you talked about how long Marco Rubio will last. How long do you think Elon Musk will last?
A few months. I think he will. He'll hang around for a few months, and then he'll get bored of Washington, and he'll get bored of playing what he views as the bureaucratic game, and he'll move on. So, I think he loves coming, having cameras trail him and so forth. But I don't. I would be surprised if he's a visible figure for more than a couple months. That's just my guess. But
yeah, I think it's going to be a very tumultuous first year of this presidency. John, thank you so much. It is always a pleasure to talk with you. Thank you especially for spending part of your holiday with me today.
It's always a pleasure, Joan. Thank you so much.